Okay, so I'm kind of excited about this one. This is I've been looking for a really good example of a tune that or a small excerpt that lends itself well to explaining how to think about transposition so that you can practice something in multiple keys. This one's great because it's not, for people who are looking at this video in terms of like wanting accompaniment excerpts and they want things to practice technical exercises. This is probably not it because this is fairly simple from a technical standpoint. And that also makes it a great example for transposing and just general comping. So let's go over some style things first. Pretty simple. I'm just pedaling harmonically, so I'm just kind of hanging out down on the pedal here and then changing with the chord. Alternatively, you could get away with pedaling every half note. Like, I think it's too empty. It leaves too much out. I think most accompaniments written like this, I think this sometimes can be, for people with a more formal background, this can be weird that this is exactly the way it looked in the original. There's no pedal markings, but it's totally implied that you pedal harmonically. Now, a lot of times you will see these things say pedal harmonically. This doesn't even say that because it's just implied. People who are working as accompanists in these styles just know that. But a lot of times in classical music, if there is not explicit pedal markings, you don't pedal it. But that's not how it works here. So you need to understand that. There's a couple of things happening in that first bar. You are going to have to get your hand under, so you need to kind of leave yourself some space there. I'm playing the first 3 melody notes with 3, 5, 1, just because it fits into a nice shape in my hand. But that means that I have to leave some space under there to get to. The other thing is, you'll notice that the pattern, the arpeggio pattern in the left hand, is always this until the second bar. That's the only place it's not this, because when we go to the B flat, it's that. So the thing is, that's because this F is hanging out on that note. Now this is relatively simple stuff, but I see this come up a lot, that people are very confused. Let's say that the part did continue up and follow the same pattern, right? And do this, right up to there. You just let off the note, especially when you're doing something like this and you're pedaling harmonically. You're going to be hanging on to it. You're going to hear that. It's no big deal. And, I actually kind of like that for the continuity of the sound. So another thing is, you don't have to play in this octave. Even if depending on the context of this, if I were accompanying like in a real setting, I might drop that left hand down the octave. Now, it might be meant to be kind of light and airy on purpose, but you can change the character of this and make it a lot more broad by just dropping in the left hand down an octave. And then you don't have the problem with that chord. Another way you can thicken it up, and this is actually really useful for playing lead sheets. A lot of times in lead sheets, you need to have your left hand available for bass lines and extra rhythmic stuff, and you need your right hand to basically fill in the chord underneath. So that's what we'll do here. So I could just fill in my melody like that. So what I'm doing is it's like, okay, I have an F major chord, so I keep the A in the top, everything else fills in under the bottom. And then when I go to the D minor chord, I've got this F on top, and I fill in the rest on the bottom. Same here. That's the 7, so I could fill it in all kinds of ways on the bottom. And then the F, I could fill it in different ways here underneath. So that's up to you. So if I filled it all the way in, that's pretty lush. You could make it a little bit more sparse by leaving out notes in the middle. So instead of playing all 3 notes of that triad underneath there, I could leave out that middle note and get a little lighter. Yeah, I have to pick a note there. So, and you could move that up the keyboard too. That makes it even lighter. See, that's a really nice sound up there just doing that, where I use the open sixths and fifths. And I do this a lot. When I'm just doing general comping, like this is something that I would end up doing to vary the character of a piece, to give an intro, to give an outro, things like that. So that's really useful places to use that variety. I did want to talk a little bit about voicings and muddiness. Unfortunately, this one's not the best example of this because we're going to start talking about moving into other keys. And it's really hard to demonstrate it with this, but I do want to get the idea out there because as you move into other keys, especially with something like jazz progressions, let's just say if I'm in the key of C, and I want to play like a 2-5-1 in C, that's fine. If I want to play that same 2-5-1 with the exact same voicing in the key of F, so if I play that 2-5-1, that's getting a little dark and muddy down there. That's a little too much. And while this is a pretty openly written thing so that you're not going to run into this problem because it's mostly wide open, as you transpose into other keys when working on any idea, you do have to be a little bit aware that as you get lower, things could get kind of muddy. The only place that you really run into it here is that if you're pedaling through where you have that 1, 5, 1, 2, 3, the lower you get on the keyboard, that little part gets a little, that's not too egregious. That's still pretty okay. It kind of depends how far down you get. At some point it starts to be a little too thick, but that's up to you. And the other thing about that is that also depends on the instrument you're playing on. Some pianos have especially if they're out of tune, it's going to get muddier faster. Some pianos have a heavier bass to them, so that becomes an issue where you have to be a little more aware of a lot of things going on there. So it's just, you're always at the mercy of whatever instrument you have, and you have to make those decisions. And if you are gigging, sometimes you have to make those decisions on the fly because, you practice it one way, but you show up and it's like, this piano doesn't work, and the voicings that I'm used to don't work because it doesn't have the amount of clarity I need in the top end. It doesn't have the clarity I need in the bottom end, whatever. Maybe there's not enough punch on one side or the other. It's unbalanced. You have to figure out ways to work that out sometimes on the fly. For hobbyists, you're probably not going to worry too much about that, but it is something to be generally aware of. So let's talk a little bit about transposing. So the first thing is that you just need to understand chords. And I don't think I want to go super in depth on chords and Roman numerals and all that here. I'll give a little bit, but like if you're not familiar with this concept, you should find somewhere that will familiarize you with this. But you need to know the chords that you're working with in the key that you're in. So in this case, I'm in the key of F. That's my 1 chord, and we walk on down. That is my 6th chord. Then we go back up to the 1 chord, and then we go to the 4 chord. If it helps you, you can write in Roman numerals, especially for really easy stuff like this. You can write in your Roman numerals. I would say from a gigging standpoint, if you need to be able to play something in multiple keys, like actually multiple keys, write in the Roman numerals for everything. If you need to be able to transpose it from one written key to another written key, just write in the chord symbols. So if I was going to if I was looking at this in F and I needed to play it in C, I'd probably just write it in C, A minor, F. Or it's actually C, A minor, C, F, right? Now I'd put those chords over the top, and then ignore the sheet music, and I would just comp the whole thing using patterns that I know and using my ear to replicate the style. But for general practice, it probably would be good for you to write in your Roman numerals and get really good at doing that mental math, because there is a small technical hurdle to transposing. Eventually you get that technical hurdle out of the way very quickly. It's remarkable with a little bit of practice how quickly the technical aspect of it is not an issue. At that point, it becomes a mental thing. how fast can you think through this chord progression in another key? So if I'm in B flat, okay, well, what's my 6th chord? Back to my 1 chord, and then what's my 4 chord? If I'm in A flat, so what's my 6th chord? What's my 1 chord? And then what's my 4 chord, right? I can do that in whatever key, pretty much at the speed of thought. For simple chord progressions, as you get to thicker chords, it gets a little more complicated because you're thinking about a lot of things. Another thing is being able to have a variety of options in terms of your capability to do good voice leading between 2 chords. So let's just talk about between my first 2 chords here. Let's just say I'm playing F, my F major in root position. For one, be able to play all of those positions. And then for your 6th chord, be able to play all of those positions. But then the real glue is getting between them. So we're going to focus on the right hand. I'll play the left hand, but the right hand is what you're really thinking about. I'm going from this, what common tones do I have? What's the nearest good voicing of that D minor? Okay, what if I'm in this position? What's the nearest position for that D minor? And then if I'm in this position, what's the nearest position? Right? So you have good voice leading that you can make that decision about, and that's the same thing for going to 4 here. If you're just using the changes that are actually in this chord progression, because in this you only go from 1 to 6 and then back to 1, so they're the same thing, and then 1 to 4 and then back to 1. So being able to do that is kind of the very you don't have to be able to do that to transpose this exact thing as written, but that is sort of a really important thing to be able to do, and then to be able to move into other keys and do the same thing technically there. That's the technical side, like that's the baseline technical part. What you'll notice as you move into other keys is that they're all the same. As you start playing this in a different key, you'll just notice that these all feel the same. So if I was playing an A flat, it feels pretty much the same. These all have a similar, like the inversion shapes feel the same. There's just a slight variation in black and white keys, but for the most part, you feel everything, it starts to all feel very much the same. It's mostly being slightly aware of like, oh, I'm in this key, so these things are flat, and so my hand needs to be in this position, but the distances are all the same. So it's really not that bad. It gets really good really fast. Then it's just an issue of how fast can you spell these chords, or how fast do you know what the 1 is, and what's the 6, and what's the 4. So let's talk about taking something like your melody here. There are 2 approaches to transposing this, and it kind of depends on where you are in terms of like your theory stuff. I will say I'll start with the easier option, but it's the less versatile one in the long run. For this, it works. So the first one is just to take, you've got your F major scale, and you know 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1. So those are your scale degrees. So you look at your melody here, and I've got 3, 5, 1. And then I've got 3, 7, 1. I can take that and put it in whatever key. Because if I'm in C, I'm 3, 5, 1, 3, 7, 1, right? If I'm in whatever, let's pick another key. I keep going to A flat, I don't know why. So if I'm in D flat, 3, 5, 1, 3, 7, 1, whoa, 7, 1, 3, 5, 1, 3, 7, 1. Ooh, okay. Playing and talking, man, I keep running into this problem. So the idea of thinking just in the scale degrees of the key you're in diatonically works pretty well. It gets a little messier when you start to have non-chord tones, and there's things that aren't diatonic. That becomes messy. You could still think, okay, that's the the flat 7 or whatever if I have an E flat, which there's going to be one in the excerpt next week. But realistically, the whole idea of thinking in one key for your melody works, but it falls apart when you think in terms of chords. So let's talk a little bit about chords. When I'm thinking about any of these chords, what I'm thinking is I'm thinking 1, 3, 5. So I'm thinking that I have the 3, 5, 1. Well, that's fine. That's the same as the key. But what about this D? I'm not thinking of this as being the 1 of F. I'm thinking of this as being the 3 of D minor. And actually sort of the flat third. There's sort of an order of operations in terms of how you can consistently think of reading chord symbols, because you won't always be in a diatonic key, and you shouldn't think in a key that can create problems. I would say that when you're reading a chord symbol, you basically think of it as, what does it say, and then what does it tell me to alter? So if it's a D, that's D major, and then the minor after that tells me to alter that to the flat 3. This matters a lot more as you get deeper into like thick jazzy chords, and you think about the scales that sort of work over those, or sort of correspond to those chords. It's a little bit out of the scope of what I'm talking about here, but just realize that I sort of think of it that way, but realistically, in the moment, I don't even think about flatting that. I just see D minor, and I just think I know what a D minor is. And that you get that way about virtually every chord with practice. But if you don't understand that order of operations, this is where people start to second guess how to spell a certain chord. It's the same reason that people have trouble with certain rhythms. If you understand how rhythmic subdivision works, you will never, ever have to ask somebody or listen to something to figure out a rhythm. There is no rhythm that you cannot figure out if you understand how subdivision works. Likewise with chords, if you understand the chord symbol and you understand what the sort of order of operations is for reading chord symbols, there's no chord symbol you cannot understand, no matter the context. Chord symbols are islands. They are not in individual keys. And that's very important. I literally have run into this problem in a professional setting, in a theater group, where somebody didn't understand this, and it actually created a little bit of chaos in the pit, because I've told this story, but she told us to play a C7 chord, right? And so those of us who understand, basic jazz stuff, we're thinking C7. That means C dominant 7. So pick a note in the C7 chord, and we did. Except some of us didn't. Some of us picked this note, the major 7. So across the pit, you've got this sound that's kind of like, it sounded like garbage. That was not what she was going for. And she's like, but I told you to play a C7. Well, here's the deal. In her brain, she was thinking, I guess, in the key of C. So to her, the diatonic 7 was what she was thinking. That's not how chord symbols work. That's not what C7 means. C7 means C dominant 7. That's just a disconnect between common practice period theory and more contemporary theory. Every chord symbol's an island. It is not in a key. And that's going to matter here. So that was quite the tangent. Let's get back to what I was talking about. Basically that D, I will be thinking of that D as the F over the top of that D minor 7 chord. That is the 3 of that. And then same thing here, back to this is easy because that's diatonic. So I've got 3, 7. And then I'm thinking of this as the 5 of that B flat. So there are so many benefits to thinking of it this way. For one, if you're doing that, you get much faster at basically playing in every key. Part of the reason is, let's say that I'm playing in the key of B flat later. I know what the 5 is because when I was practicing the key of F, I was thinking of that F as being the 5 of B flat. So if I'm in the key of B flat and I'm like, oh, what's my 5 chord? It's F, because I've just gotten so good at thinking what is any given scale degree, and whatever the scale degree is, that corresponds to that chord. So if I've had to think of something, and let's say there's a G, if I ended on a G, and I have to think of that as the 6 of B flat. So I'm in the key of B flat, and I'm like, oh, what's my 6 chord? Okay, like immediately, I just know what it is because I have double practiced it by doing it in other keys. I'll also say for this, you've got these patterns. This is great. This left-hand pattern, I'm thinking is 1, 5, 1, 2, 3. You could think of it as 1, 5, 1, 9, 3. I actually talked just recently in a video about this pattern and about the whole idea of add 2s versus add 9s. they're functionally the same thing. So we'll just go with that. So I'm just going to call it 1, 5, 1, 2, 3. And then I go to this D chord, and I'm thinking 1, 5, 1, 2, 3. As it's written on the page, it's 1, 5, 1, 2, 1. And then the same thing with B flat, 1, 5, 1, 2, 3. So you can see how that's a little easier because I'm thinking each of those chords and I'm thinking this pattern for those things. And I could go to the 5 chord and it still works. And I'm thinking that pattern. It gets a little more complicated if you actually think of it in terms of the scale degrees of the key for each chord, because now you're thinking 1, 5, 1, 2, 3, and then you're thinking, what are you even thinking? You're thinking like 6, 3, 6, 7, 6. No. It makes things more complicated than they need to be. So for melodies, if you have to think diatonically to the key, but you'll run into a point where there's too many non-diatonic notes. You'll run into situations, this is especially an issue in jazz, where you're changing key centers constantly. And even in just pop music, you'll change key centers briefly for little bits of time. And now if you have to think, is this the 7 in this key or the 3 in this key, or like what key am I? No, just think, what part of the chord are you on? And that's universal. So I almost shouldn't have brought up the other method because it's just inferior long term. It is good in ear training, especially with like solfege. There is a place for that. I don't know that it's the best for this sort of transposition. Anyway, so now you kind of have an idea of how to do that. Now you probably want to separate this out, and especially if this is technically not an easy thing for you to do, then just turn that into an exercise. Like that whole left hand is an exercise. So now I'm playing it in the key of C, right? Just whatever key. You can just play it in every key, right? That's going to get messy, isn't it? And so you just have to think, and some of those keys are a little harder to think through if you're doing an F sharp or G flat. And like I said, it's mental. So with things like F sharp and G flat, I would try to do it in both keys. That seems weird, but you need to be able to think it in both keys. I have run into problems on my own where, because I didn't think in the enharmonic keys, I found that I'm a little slower reading one of the chord symbols versus the other. And in the real world, I run into that a lot where that's actually an issue. A little bit with like F sharp and G flat, but every once in a while it's a real mess with something like B flat or B major and C flat major. Ugh, that sucks. It happens. So it's just unfortunate. I don't worry too much about C flat major. I don't run to it that much, but let me tell you, it does happen, and it's you can tell that you're just slower at reading it because you don't ever practice it mentally. Everything physically, technically is the same. So yeah, you can separate those out, and then you can just add the melody back in. So if I'm in C, and I'm just throwing it up the octave so that it's a little clearer. All right. And so this is actually a really good thing to just practice in every key. You could also change the order of the chords here. I could go through. Not necessarily with the melody, but you could just do that. So you've got that kind of chord progression to the 4, to the 6, to the 4, or to the 1 again, or you could go to the 6, down to the 4, and that's actually kind of nice, isn't it? So you can mess with that. You could actually, if you want to throw some more chords in there, absolutely. This chord progression or this pattern, 100% great over. I would always recommend everybody do 1 6 4 5 and 1 5 6 4. So So let's just comp it in C for simple simplicity. So 6, 4, 5. Those are the most common things, and then also going to 5. Just because those are the chords you're going to run into the most. First, you're going to run into 1, 4, and 5. Or sorry, 1, 4, and 5. 1 in order. I would say 1 and 5, and then 4, and then 6, and then it all goes downhill from there. I'd probably say 3 is the next chord that comes up after 6 most often. So. So yeah, just use a little bit of the 3 chord there. The 3 chord is used in that pocket bell progression. But those are just some things. This is probably the easiest because these are all in root position. When you start transposing things where things start being not in root position, that's a little harder. It just takes a little more mental math. But if you have a foundation where you can spell the things in from the root positions, and you can think whatever you want, that's gonna just make it a little bit easier. You just get a little bit faster to where the analogy that I tend to use is of a stop sign. When you look at a stop sign, there are so many things you know instantaneously about a stop sign. You know it's red. You know it has 4 letters on it. You know what those letters are, S-T-O-P. You know what those letters spell, the word stop. You know what stop means in the context of just, your language, and in the context of English anyway. You know the context that sign means, oh, that applies to cars. It doesn't necessarily mean to people walking, depending on where you're at. There are signs for that. A lot of times they have, the shape of the sign is an octagon, and a lot of times it has a white border around it. Those are all things that you look at a stop sign and you know all of those things instantly. Nobody has to, if somebody asks, what color is that stop sign? You go, well, it's red. How many letters? 4. You don't do that. And that's a whole lot of different pieces of information, but you just look at it and you know them. You know all of those pieces right now. And that's where you want to get with your chords, where you look at an F major chord and you don't have to go, okay, it's F, A, C. You're not doing like a slow mental math. You're not going, okay, the 3rd is A and the 5 is C. No, you don't do that. You look at an F major chord and all of those things, you know them instantaneously. Like it's just in your brain. And you look at, you're in the key of F and you just think, I know all my diatonic chords in that key. I know the qualities of those chords. And hopefully maybe your diatonic 7th chords on top of your triads. You just keep expanding that to where it has that sort of stop sign quality to it, where you just don't have to think about it. And this, transposing through a lot of keys helps you get there really quickly, and it makes you less trapped in whatever key you're in. Anyway, I have rambled for way too long about this. Got a little out of hand. But hopefully that was helpful. I'm going to call it here.